How can we compare two strings in order to figure out whether they contain the same, whether they have the same content, whether, for example, they have exactly the same word? The first idea that probably comes to mind is to use the double equals operator. So suppose we have string x and string y. We can say x equals y. This is an idea that, although it probably is the first one that comes to mind, we really need to fight it, because this is not the correct way to compare content for the strings. Remember that strings are objects. So if we say x equals y, it will be correct syntactically. The compiler will not produce any errors. However, it will not compare them in the way that we like them. When we use equals equals, what we are actually comparing when we have references, it's the memory addresses of the objects. If x points to one object and y points to a different object, what does that really mean? Remember the discussion we had on references. The x will actually have a value inside it, which will be the memory address where the object is stored. Y will have a value, a different value, and that value will be again, that number will be again, the memory address where its own object is stored. Unless x and y are actually referencing exactly the same object, even if the values of the objects are the same, equals equals will return false, because the objects will be different. If we want to compare the content of these two objects, and we don't really care if they are different objects, what we want to compare is whether the value of the object is the same, then we need to use the equals method. And we will say x dot equals y. Let's see an example so that we try to make this clearer. We are using the Java Visualizer website where we put our code, and then it gives us while the order of execution and how the picture in memory looks like. We have this simple program here. We have declared on line 3 a string, and a string variable, and we have it be equal to hi. On line 4 we have a different string variable b, and we are actually using the constructor, the string constructor, but the message we have in the constructor is exactly the same. Remember, strings are objects, we have a string class, we can use the new operator with a string constructor. So what do we expect A and B to look like? A and B will both be referencing strings with a value hi. And we can move the execution forward, and you will see we have a variable a, which is referencing a string with a value hi. We have a variable b, which is referencing again a string with a value hi. However, these two strings are different. They are two different objects. They just happen to have exactly the same value. Now, what do we do here? We have two print statements where we are asking two different questions. One is A equal to B? And we ask that question with a double equals operator. And when we move forward, you will not see any change on the picture on the right, but you will see the program output at the bottom. A double equals B returns to us false. Why? Because the double equals operator will check whether the references are the same, whether A and B reference the same object. However, when we execute the line 7, which says A dot equals B, that will return true, because the content, the value of those two objects is the same. They are both hi. So if we are interested in comparing the value of the strings, the value of the objects, which is what most of the times we want to do, then we should be using the equals method, not the double equals on references. Let's go back and edit our code and add a few more lines that I have written here, so I'm just going to copy paste to save some of your watching time, viewing time, and go again and visualize the execution of this code. What did we add here? All I did was add another string, which is string C, that has again the value hi. And then I do exactly the same thing. I compare it with string A, that is defined in a similar way as string C, with both the double equals operator and the equals method. And I would like you to be careful here because we are going to see something new. It is not a repetition of what we saw with string B. Now I'm going to go forward a little bit so that we reach the state where we want. Things haven't changed with strings A and B. What is very interesting to see is that when we say string C becomes equal to hi, that will not create another hi string. But what will happen is that C will reference exactly the same string that A references. And this should be very surprising to you. The reason it is surprising is because we have not mentioned a rule or a detail about how strings are created in Java. There is something called interning for strings. So there is a pool of strings, a pool of string literals, a pool of string objects. And when we want to use the same value for a string later in our program, Java, the Java virtual machine, so that it optimizes its performance, will not actually create a new string object, but it will use the same object it had created before. It will use again this pool of strings and will have our new variable reference that string that it already has. The situation is not the same with B. You might think, well, shouldn't that happen also on line 4? We're actually just using hi, which is already used before for variable A. Why was it that B is not referencing the same string as A? The reason is that we have created this string through the constructor, and that forces the Java virtual machine to actually create a new string object even though the value is the same. When we use this shortcut that Java allows us to use for string literals, when we don't use the constructor, then, if possible, Java will reuse the strings that we have used before. So A and C now reference exactly the same string object. And this is called string interning. Now, if we want to see what the program will output, you already see false and true for the comparison between A and B, as we mentioned it before. Let's move it forward. Now, yes, the double equals operator does give us back true when we compare A and C. Why? Because they reference exactly the same string object. They point to exactly the same memory address. And as expected, the dot equals will also give back true because the content is also the same.